And we're live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's Inside.net. I'm your host, also Philip. I'm joined with my friend here. Let me turn this way.
Yeah.
Alon Lee, and also Rodney Littles the second. And as you can see, we have a full house today, right? This is probably the most people we've ever had on the stream at the same time. So I'm
I
expecting
love
this to be
it.
a lot of fun. This is going to be really cool. Today, we're going to be talking about how we could build apps for .NET MAUI without using XAML, which for me, I'm definitely interested in because I'll be honest with you, I'm not the biggest fan of markup all the time. And sometimes you just want to live in C sharp world, which is a nice place to be. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And to help us do that, we have our two guests here, Brandon and Michael, and they're going to talk to us about how we could build these types of apps. So why don't we do a quick left to right set of introductions? So Brandon, why don't you go first? Tell folks a little bit about who you are and what do you do?
Sure. Thanks, Cecil. And thanks so much for having me on the show. My name's Brandon Minnick. I currently work at AWS as a .NET developer advocate. But actually, back in the day, I used to work at a company called Xamarin, which Microsoft acquired and eventually turned into .NET MAUI. So I go way back with creating mobile apps using C Sharp, and I've never used XAML in any of my apps. So excited to be talking about this today because Michael and I were talking before the show about feels like he and I have been kind of beating this C Sharp UI drum for years now, and it's now becoming a thing. It seems like more people are understanding it, adopting it, kind of questioning why XAML. Like, why are we doing using XAML in an app that's all in C Sharp in the first place? But yeah, thanks so much for having me. I can't wait to dive into it.
Awesome. Thank you, Brandon. And Michael?
Hey, Mike Stonis. I'm a mobile architect. I have a company named 8bot where we do, mobile applications, things like that, everything .NET. Been doing forms development since the inception of it, back before XAML was even an option. And so kind of like Brandon was saying there, it just kind of cut my teeth on always writing UIs and code. And then when XAML came around, I actually used to be like a Windows Phone developer and WPF. So I loved XAML back in the day, but it just didn't feel right anymore. We had code. C Sharp's my favorite language, and we had like the perfect editor to do it. So I think I was rooming with Brandon one day, and we talked about how we both like writing UIs without XAML, and I was like, perfect. I got another one in my camp here. So super excited to talk about this today. Super excited to be here, and I think it's a cool topic with lots of good stuff for people to learn.
Awesome. So, but before we dive into that conversation, what I want to do is I'm going to switch over to my screen. And let's take a quick look at some of the cool things that have been happening in the community. So first one I want to highlight, Laurent, a friend of ours, he wrote this interesting blog post about debugging applications with Dapper using Writer Visual Studio. So we've had some folks come on the show before to talk about Dapper, but for folks that don't know, it's like a toolkit that kind of helps you build microservices a little bit easier, right?
It's like a micro ORM, right?
No, well, not really like the ORM, but you can think about it as like all of those different pieces that you use to build microservices. So you think about state storage, you think about service discovery, you think about centralized configuration, you think about triggers and bindings, you think about actors. All of those things like Dapper will allow you to do that, but also in a very like language agnostic way, right? So It's not like a NuGet package that you install in your app or npm package or whatever. It's actually like a little executable that you install and you just kind of interact with it using HTTP calls. But now you could like sprinkle it around your environment, right? And then now you just have microservices, right? And then now you can start making calls to those things.
Awesome.
Nice.
But the reason why that's important, because it is not a NuGet package and because it is like an executable, how do I actually run this when I run my applications? And so for folks that are Visual Studio users, there's like an option that when you debug, you'll have to like start up a process. There's like an add process to start up button or something of the sort. And I think there's some screenshots in here that show it. But yeah, something like this, right? So like whenever I start up my debugger, I want you to like spin up this background process as well, right? I think they call it like tools or whatever in Visual Studio. But anyway, it's important because again, you need that Dapper thing to run. But then how do I have my .NET process run and also have like the Dapper process? And so pretty much this blog post kind of goes through and talks through a little bit about how you can make that like a little bit of an easier process for things. So definitely make sure you check that out. And also, I will be dropping the links inside of the chat. So for folks that are like, hey, I can't see like the little URL thing at the top, like I promise I'll put it in the chat. We'll have the links available for all of you in a second. This next one, I was actually watching this YouTube video today, and I thought it was really cool. Amichai, who is a software developer at Microsoft, is doing like these C# riddles. So there's this really very, as you can see, very short snippets of code, but really interesting questions to be like, hey, what do you think this piece of code does, right? So as you can see, here's the actual riddle, and throughout the video, he explains it and talks to you about like, well, what's happening here, or what the output is, and why the output is what it is. And you might be surprised why things work the way that they work after you take a look at this. I'm not going to spoil it for you. I definitely want you to go look at the video.
That looks super cool.
Yeah.
So this is good for a lot of reasons.
I hate that code.
I
saw that in a pull request, immediately rejected.
Like, I'm bad at this game, so the fact that somebody's playing the game and like they're showing you how it works, like kudos, because I don't know what that code does. I'm not a compiler. I'm not a runtime.
This feels like I'm looking at JavaScript code. This seems like something that you shouldn't be able to do.
Is that using var statement? Like, wait a minute, why do I need to using var? Is it disposable? I'm confused.
But the thing I think that's interesting about these riddles, and the thing that we just saw just now, is that like we have folks here in this stream with all different levels of experience, and everyone is looking at it like, what is this thing?
For sure.
Oh, I feel better now then.
This is really just little riddles like these are always really cool and like interesting brain exercises to be like, hey, well, if I did run this code, like what does this allow me to do? Like, unlike Brandon said, like I probably shouldn't do it, but like what does it do? Like I want to know, like what is the thing that's coming out of this when I run this application? So again, you can check him out on YouTube on his channel. His name is Amichai, and this one's called Why is everyone getting this riddle wrong? Right? How sharp is your C# riddle number 1? Right? So you can make sure you check that out.
I like that question. How sharp is your C#?
Yeah, how sharp is your C#?
I like that.
And the last link that I want to show, because we have a friend of ours, Brandon is here from Amazon, and Amazon's actually having an Amazon App Store Dev Day, which is happening actually right now. Don't leave, stay here. But it's happening right now. It's going to be going on for a couple hours. They're going to be talking about like developer opportunities for actually building in the Amazon App Store. Again, it's not just .NET, but I'm sure there's a lot of other languages and things of that nature that you could use to kind of like contribute to that space. So if folks are interested in like participating in like their marketplace or applications, definitely make sure you head over there and check that out. Now, that being said, this is no longer our show. This is Brandon and Michael's show. So let's start talking about like building these applications without XAML. And I think it'll be good to kind of put some context to it, right? So I know for a fact, Alana and I, make sure I'm pointing in the right way.
Yeah.
Alana and I are not mobile developers, but we know Rodney for sure has experience, and obviously you too.
What Rodney?
What did you say?
You said Rodney who?
No, I don't have any experience in this space.
So anyway, like there's people in the room that can build mobile applications, but for me, I spend a lot of time in the backend. And so backend developers, we are just writing raw C# most of the time, right? Mm-hmm. APIs or background services or whatever the case is. And it's usually not a lot of like markup or front-end code or anything of the sort, right? And so now when it comes to the hey, you're the .NET developer in this company, build like the Windows Form app and build like the web app, but build the mobile app too. And you're just like, wow, I gotta learn all this stuff. Like can't I just write C# and get the thing done, right? And so for me, that's kind of like the perspective I'm taking it from. Like, can I just write C# and be productive and do some of these things? And I'm guessing that the answer is yes. Is that true?
Yeah, I'd say, yeah, pretty much. I mean, because what we'll be talking about today is we're talking about .NET MAUI, which stands for Multi-Platform Application User Interface. So they kind of crammed the acronym in there, but MAUI is basically you're creating an application that you're more or less writing the code once, and it's going to run on iOS, Android, Windows Desktop, and macOS Desktop. So in that sense, yes. Are there still some rough edges with MAUI? Absolutely, because MAUI relies for Windows on WinUI under the hood. a lot of the WinUI things are still being developed. So like I've personally found a lot of rough edges, making an app that works great on iOS and macOS, but then I try to run the same app on Windows and it's like, oh, well, I guess that just doesn't work yet. So the good news is I've been watching the team. They're working hard on .NET 8 right now. And there's been tons of bug fixes and performance improvement, PRs coming in. So hoping to see MAUI grow and mature a little bit, because it is still fairly new. It's based on technology from Xamarin, which is decades old now, which makes me feel old to say. But it also at the same time is a new framework. It is a new library. And yeah, anytime you basically rip the guts out and replace them, there's going to be some rough edges. So yeah, definitely. If you're a C# developer, if you're a .NET developer and you're looking to create iOS and Android apps, absolutely highly recommend .NET MAUI. And if you're willing to put up with some rough edges for now around Windows, you can still do it. You just might have to tweak your app, like the Windows specific version of the app a little bit, to do some workarounds. But yeah, it's a really cool tool for writing that code once and running it on multiple platforms, so you don't have to write your iOS code in Swift and then recreate the same app in Kotlin for Android and recreate the same app in C# for WinForms or WPF or something like that. So it saves a ton of time, especially for like guys like me who are just independent developers. I publish apps to the App Store that I don't make any money off of. I just do it for fun, and it would kill me if I had to rewrite the same app multiple times, multiple languages, and fix multiple bugs in multiple repositories. It'd be brutal. So yeah, very thankful.
That's kind of like the crux of it for me, because when you think about like, hey, I want to do iOS and Android and Windows, you're already talking about Swift and maybe Java and .NET, right? And then the languages on top, like the UI languages on top of it, like, are you going to have to write it in XAML? Are you going to have to write it in C#? Things like that. So I think having this one platform, having MAUI where we could just write everything in C# already is a huge win. It's already lowered like the cognitive burden of, I already know how to write C#, right? And so, as we'll talk about here, staying in that realm, and especially, like if you're a C# developer, continue to do the thing that you do best, right? If you're a back-end developer and you know how to write C# and you know how to do everything there, just kind of continue on doing what you're doing, building these cool mobile apps out there on this platform, but not have to worry about yet another language. Even if it's just a markup language, it's still yet another language to have to learn out there.
Yeah.
Is that a dig at XAML?
Shots fired.
But it's anything else though, like for me, every time I have to switch over, like every once in a while, I'll look at Swift UI or I'll look at, whatever it is. I'll have to do some like Blazor or Razor code type of stuff out there. And I just have to sit and look at it for a while. Like, all right, where do I put the curly braces in this one? Oh, no, it's % signs here and curly braces.
That's a lot.
How do I escape this? And it's
That is a lot. So, okay, I have a question. So what is like the difference between XAML, HTML, and it just being a markup language? Is it the fact that you do have to switch? Like, how does that been in your experience?
I can partially answer this. So yeah. So the idea is, especially as we could get into it further too, but like the idea being you want to separate out like your presentation from your business logic. So you'll have some presentation layer. Usually that would be like HTML just to show, if we're on the web, that'd be HTML. If we're talking about MAUI or Microsoft Land, that's usually XAML. And XAML's just fancy XML, right? All it is just XML with other stuff in it. And so the idea being that you would only have your UI and you would, and this will probably be me being jaded a little bit, you would find some developer, this non-existent, or not developer, you find this non-existent designer that knows how to use XAML because they're out there and they're definitely not just using whatever kind of tooling that they would be using day in and day out. And that you could give that UI to that designer to go do your work or do whatever out there.
I've never actually seen that happen in my almost 10 years being a mobile developer. I've never seen the designer take the design and give me XAML. Not once. And I've written a couple of apps with XAML, and not once has a designer done it. So, you're not making good on this promise that you make, but yet you're forcing me to continue to use this tooling based on a promise that you haven't upheld.
Right.
So for me, XAML has always been a rough area because, Mike, this, Brandon, you'll find out. I came from the C# world. My first go into it was writing C# UI with Xamarin iOS, and it was like it was easy, it was normal. And then Forms came and XAML got pushed down our throats, and I was like, everyone else is doing it because they're a Microsoft developer, so I guess I'll learn it. Otherwise, I won't be able to keep doing my job. But I never really liked it. It was always extra stuff that didn't give us any value. And while it did separate the UI from the business logic, it didn't really, right? Like what it gave us was this kind of hodgepodge of back and forth being dependent on a binding engine, and you have to still set up events in your UI layer, but it's not technically it just caused a kerfuffle for me. And I always looked at it from a place of, you look at Kotlin, you look at Swift, you look at Flutter. These languages don't require a different language for us to create presentation. So why do we do it in this Microsoft product? And that was right around the time where somebody had submitted a pull request to Xamarin to get the extensions put in. And I was like, yes, the world is a better place because we can do it all in C#.
Totally.
Okay, so I have another question. Can you ever really separate business logic from the UI? Because they're gonna have to. Okay.
Well, now we're getting philosophical here.
Yeah. This might be a holy war pretty quick. I would say yes.
You can physically do it. It's possible. Yeah. I've seen it once.
I feel like that one just gets into definitions and how people define what business logic is and what UI is.
At some point,
like me personally, I think of it as anything that needs to be done on the UI thread goes into my view or goes into that presentation layer, whereas everything else that doesn't need the UI thread, that's my business logic. But people will look at my code and be like, why is this over here? Shouldn't it be over there? Like, shouldn't we be calling this from the view model? I'm like, well, yeah, but I would need to promote that to the UI thread. And if we're working with the UI thread, isn't that the UI? And so everybody's got a different answer for you, and everybody's right and everybody's wrong at the same time.
At the end of the day, the question is, does it work? Yes? No?
Can you test it?
That is a good question.
Is it maintainable?
Great. Let's go. So Brandon, how about this? Like, why don't we take a look and see what it takes to actually get started, or even just build any of these types of apps without using MAUI. So I'm going to switch over to your screen, and then why don't we kind of just dive into it?
Let's do it.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. So I've got got a couple slides here. I feel like it's helpful to give some context around what we'll be talking about today, and then we'll dive into some code. But what you'll see on the slides here is a URL here at the bottom. So codetraveler.io/MAUI-markup. This is a web page I put together for us where you can find all the resources from today. So all the slides are posted there. There's videos I've made before where I've talked about this as well. And I've also got links to the sample apps that we'll be looking at today and the open source repositories that we'll be playing around with today. So don't worry about memorizing anything. If you can just copy paste this link, bookmark it, favorite it, whatever, you can find everything we'll be talking about. So let's get into it a little bit, because we're going to be focusing on C# today, but I also want to highlight that there's a lot of UI options in .NET MAUI. So obviously, we've been talking about XAML a lot, and I think this is still the most popular way for that .NET MAUI developers make their apps or make the UI for their apps. And if I'm being honest, I think it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy that XAML became most popular, because back in the day when I was working at Xamarin, all of our docs only showed XAML examples, and we had this really cool thing called Xamarin University that, heck, Mike and I actually used to teach classes for Xamarin University, and all the classes were taught in XAML. And so if you're new to, well, back then it was Xamarin, then Xamarin Forms, now .NET MAUI. But if you're new to it, then all the resources you can find are only in XAML. You're going to assume you have to use XAML. So I always find it ironic that people say like, well, I do it because it's the most popular. And it's like, well, isn't that just kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy? Like, it doesn't mean it's the best, but there's a lot of great tutorials out there that teach XAML. And if you've used XAML before, you're going to feel right at home. You know, the XAML in .NET MAUI is different than the XAML in, say, WPF, or the XAML in, what's the other one I'm missing? WinUI or Windows, the Windows XAML. So different flavors, because there's different typesets and stuff like that. But certainly the most popular, but not what we're going to be talking about today. Another option that I don't know if many people even know this is that you can actually use CSS to style your apps. So you can't. Yeah, right. They came out with this feature years ago, and the community just
3.0.
Yeah, like the community just hated it. They got so much flack because all the existing developers obviously were not using CSS. So they're like, why would you spend all this time adding CSS support? I don't even need it. And, you know, the response is just basically like, well, it's not for you then. But
Clearly.
right. Like if you don't want to use it, then don't use it. But this is a cool feature that there's web developers that come to mobile and they're familiar with CSS, and they can use it. And so I think because of that kind of backlash from the community at the time, like this feature, the announcement really got squashed and not a lot of resources came out of it. Cause grizzled veterans like me we already have our way of doing things, and this is different. So you can use XAML to style your UI. You can't use you can use CSS to style your UI. You can't use it to create the UI, just like in the web. Like you would create the UI using HTML for your website, and then you can style it using CSS. So fun fact that probably nobody knows about. Another good one is Blazor. So if you're a web developer, you're familiar with Blazor, you can absolutely make a iOS and Android app using .NET MAUI and the Blazor syntax, which is really cool. Like this code snippet here is literally I just copy pasted I went file new app. I said .NET MAUI Blazor mobile, I think is what the template's called. And I just took a screenshot of the code. So this is Blazor code, but it'll run on iOS, Android, macOS, and Windows, which is really, really cool. So you can bring over your existing skills. And I just realized, there we go. That was a copy paste error.
So, could this be considered similar to the Blazor hybrid? Or is this Blazor hybrid?
I believe so. Are you guys familiar with the naming?
Hybrid. Yeah, they call this the Blazor hybrid. Yes. I personally have not done file new with it because, again, I have my own opinions and my old-timey ways. But this is something, like Brandon's saying, that it brings the Blazor crowd to the mobile platform.
I think it's pretty compelling though, because again, if it's your skill set and you spend most of your day writing Blazor web UI, this is actually a pretty good fit for you. So in the same way that XAML might be. So.
Absolutely. But what we're here to talk about today is doing it all in C#. So there's a couple shameless plugs going on because all the code we're looking at today, you need this library down here, communitytoolkit.maui.markup. It's actually created by me. I leveraged a lot of code from Xamarin Forms markup, but we've built on it. We've improved it for .NET MAUI. And this NuGet package is essentially just a bunch of extension methods. If you dig down into the code, that's really all it is. But it allows us to, if you look here, where we say like dot row, dot column. These are the extension methods that you get with the Community Toolkit MAUI markup NuGet package. And it allows you to write this really fluent UI code, all in C#. Because one of the fun facts that Michael mentioned earlier is you could always create your Xamarin Forms apps in C#. You didn't ever have to use XAML, and actually Xamarin Forms existed before they even added XAML support. So when Xamarin Forms first came out, you had to use C#. But when you write your code in C# without these extension methods, the code just gets really hard to read. Whereas here, it's very much top to bottom, left to right. Like we're creating a new grid, we're defining our row and column spacing, we're naming our rows here. So if you've ever used XAML before, you know how much of a pain it is to use rows and columns, because you're like, okay, let's see. So there's 5 rows, but the rows start counting at 0, and I want to put this in the second row, but because we start at 0, that's actually row number 1, and like I've lost, I've lost hours of my life because I put it in row 1, and then I run the app, and it's in the wrong place. I'm like, oh, that's right. It's not. It's a second row, but it's not like so. Yeah. I love this because you can actually name your rows. So like, I have this unit type row, I have this number to convert row, and then when I put my children into the grid, I know I'm putting this label into the row unit type and into the column label, which is really, really cool. So we get some goodies like that with where we can name our rows and columns. But what's really nice is this syntax where we can just write it in line, and you can really start to see in your mind's eye what this grid looks like, because you're reading it in the code the same way it appears on the screen. And the other nice thing, and we're going to dig into all this in a bit, is bindings become really, really cool. So I just pushed out an update to Community Toolkit MAUI.markup about a month or so ago, where I added support for what are called typed bindings, where you can actually point to exactly the property you want in your view model. And this is great because regular bindings, when you don't do this, require reflection. So anybody that's created a MAUI app or a Xamarin Forms app before is probably familiar with the fact that you always have to call iNotify property changed, and you have to pass in the name of the property that changed. But if you think about it, you're passing that in as a string. And all iNotify property change is doing is shouting back up to the view, up to your UI layer, and saying, hey, this property changed. I don't know anything else about it. So to get the information about that property, bindings have always had to use reflection to essentially dig back into your view model, get the new value of that property, because iNotify property change just gave it a string. With this, there is no reflection. So we're pointing to exactly the property in our view model, and we don't have any of that overhead. And then if you want to get really into performance, I always recommend adding the static keyword anytime you're doing an anonymous method like this. So like this is just a anonymous method. It's a function. It's a func for getting down into it. This actually might be an expression if you want to get really into it. But yeah, by adding static, that means we don't have to reallocate this back on the stack every time the binding changes, every time we call this method. So you get some really, really cool performance improvements because of that. You don't have to use XAML anymore, which is really nice. You can keep it all in C#, but at the end of the day, like we're still doing MVVM, we still have our view layer, we still have our view model layer. None of that changes. It's just instead of writing the view in XAML, we're writing the view in C#.
So I got a whole bunch of questions.
I got to jump on this.
Me too.
This is quick. I have a whole bunch of questions. So my first question is, like you'd mentioned, prior to this, like developers would have to use reflection. So are you using something like Roslyn or source generators? Like how are you getting past
Ooh, good question. So I did gloss over something, and I should highlight this. If you are a XAML developer, you may have heard of something called compiled bindings. That's basically what this is, if you dig into the .NET MAUI source code, which like I had to go real deep into the weeds to add this feature, but if you dig deep enough, you'll find out compiled bindings under the hood use this type that this binding type called typed bindings that the .NET MAUI team created. The only tough part about that is that typed binding class isn't public. It's not something that you can just create a new type binding. But we have this really cool relationship with the Community Toolkit and the .NET MAUI team where they granted us access to all the internals. So for our libraries for the Community Toolkit, we can take advantage of it. And so this is how I was able to surface this feature. So basically, yeah, I'm just using what the .NET MAUI developers already implemented, but they only added it for XAML developers for some reason. And like, I remember when compiled bindings first came out, like my first question, literally, like I was working at Microsoft at the time. I pinged the team. I was like, hey guys, this sounds awesome, but I don't use XAML. I do everything in C#. How do I use compiled bindings in C#? And the answer is just always, huh? Like we didn't even think about that. Why would you want to use this in C#?
They work out.
So this is like a culmination of years of both wanting this and finally being able to implement it. And I'm super proud of this. This is
awesome.
pretty new. I think we just pushed this out in February.
Oh, this is awesome.
Nice.
Okay. So that, like the next, this is gonna be my last question because I want you to go on. So, what we're looking at here in terms of the code snippet, like this is the markup from your extension, right? So if I didn't have your package, the code would look nothing like this. Is what
Completely different.
Yeah.
C# code, for example, code would look completely different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, because here, what's nice about this, again, it reads top to bottom, left to right. But if we didn't have these extension methods like .row and .column, well, I would have to initialize this new dark purple label somewhere up here, somewhere above where I initialize the grid. So I'd have to say var unit type label equals new dark purple label, and then I would say like row or grid.row. I would have to define all that code above, and then here you would still see children equals, but instead of new dark purple label, it would just be my variable that I instantiated earlier. And I mean, that's how I made my Xamarin Forms apps for years. There's nothing wrong with it. But once I saw this and the readability, it's a total game changer. You're just like, oh, I can visualize the UI now. I don't have to flip back and forth between two spots in my code. Like, okay, what row did I put dark purple label? Okay, and then down here, okay. It's beautiful. I love the way this looks.
To be fair, right? The reality is I could take that dark purple label, assign it to a variable, and do the same quote unquote old school style that you're talking about, right? There's nothing that says I have to do it this way. This is where like my questions start to open up, and Michael, I involve you because we've written C# UI together, so like you get it, right? This is more of like a fluent builder syntax, right? So this kind of gets closer to your concept of like an immutable UI, right? Where you're constructing the UI once, and the UI, now granted, you told me they're typed bindings, so it's not technically immutable. I get it. But you're constructing it inline using a builder, and you're not using any of the previous ways of doing things that we would have done them in C#, right? We would have declared a bunch of variables and then stuck everything correctly where it belongs in the grid, and it becomes very, very difficult to read. But with the C# extensions, it turns everything into, I have a UI element and I have a bunch of builder methods on the end of that know what they belong to, and I can just fluently define this dark purple label or this label that is dark purple but has micro font, right? And now I can start to define types using these builder syntaxes. And instead of it just being a dark purple label, I have dark purple label with micro font, dark purple label with, large font. So, and this is going to be kind of to the both of you, is this approach better? Have you found it to be better when building UIs than the old school approach of defining all your stuff at the top of the function and then sticking it all in at the end?
I mean, I'm insanely biased because I literally write this library. But yes, like a million times, yes. Be able to see everything in one place is transformational. And yeah, like you were saying, Rodney, like you can still do it the other way. There's nothing stopping you. You don't have to use this NuGet package. You don't have to use the extension methods. But I will never go back. It's one of those things like once you see the light, you're like, oh, okay, no, that makes too much sense. Like, I didn't know I needed this.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is I can use your NuGet package and still have my cake and eat it too, right? I can still define my elements using this fluid approach. And if I just happen to be stuck in my old-timey ways and want to define a variable for that dark purple label, you don't stop me from doing it.
There's even an extension method for it. There's .assign, so you can still do it in the fluid method as well. So
I love it, right? And that to me is the value, right? When you present to me, force me out of my comfort zone and gives me a boost to my productivity, that's where the value is, right? Now I'm getting value out of it. I don't have to change the way I do things. You're just giving me another tool for my toolbox. And this is beautiful, by the way. Like, I love this.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
The thing I like about it as well is it doesn't break the paradigm of what MAUI is either. It's not like we're not leaving MVVM territory. It's not like an MVU change. It's not something that you have to 100% buy into. So like if you have an older application that you want to, I've got a new page coming up, you could introduce this and use this on that page, or use this as you refactor things or stuff like that. So it's very like, it's progressive, right? You know, we have old applications that I've been maintaining for probably close to a decade now. And every time we build a new page or have to go change it, I just go into the UI part, clean up the old way of doing it and just bring it to this. And then, you know, you've got all this, like, again, very readable UI. It's like when I think of what the big selling point of XAML is to like a developer, it's that I can just look at my code quickly and get a kind of the gist of what's going on in my UI. You could do that here. And I think you could probably even do that better here because it's just more concise. You don't have all the XAML-ness that comes along with it, right? So yeah, it's hard to go, you know, once you kind of do it, especially if you've written like the C# UIs the old way, this becomes like a no-brainer. Like it's just so hard to come back to, easy to adopt. It's just really like a no downsides type of thing. Again, it'll be like future-proof. It's not exactly like it's gonna, you know, it's not maintained like as a separate weird thing, I guess, right? You know, it's like it's still part of the community and the environment. It's just sort of a better way to do all of it.
So I have a question. There are some words that were used that I'm not really familiar with. One of them being anonymous methods. Is that the one? I'm not sure if that's like it's more advanced or what is that?
Yeah, like if you're familiar with a func or an action.
Like a lambda function.
Yep. It's basically just kind of another term for that. I mean, there's subtle differences, between lambda functions and anonymous methods. But yeah, it just means like I am basically writing a method here. Whoops, accidentally clicked the mouse. I'm writing a method here in line. And whereas back in the old days, like I would have to write a method as a method, and then I could pass it in here. So that would be like a named method that I could pass in. But this method doesn't exist anywhere else. It doesn't have a name. It's just anonymous. But yeah, funcs, anonymous methods, actions, lambdas, they're all basically the same thing. Just a way to pass around methods as a variable.
Yeah, we like to be confusing in .NET.
Right? I just felt like I was like a little bit in the dark about that one. I was like, I've heard of the lambdas. I'm like, okay, anonymous.
Yeah, so I would say, Alan, if you've ever written any link as an example, like,
like
so if you've written link, you've written a lot of those anonymous lambdas before, right?
Okay.
That's how you specify the condition or the predicate, right? So if you write a where, and you're going to say, I don't know, X such that X dot blah, blah, blah does whatever. You know what I mean? Like that thing with the arrow, like that's the lambda, right? And so if you kind of squint your eyes and turn sideways, you can kind of see the pattern there inside a brand new function, right? instead of calling it X, he calls it like, what's that called? Conversion model or whatever, right?
Yep,
And then there's
that's
the
my view
arrow,
model,
and
yeah.
then there's the thing that comes after, which would be the body of the function.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Our friend Alan Ritchie says that he started to use the markup extensions, and they are fantastic. That is a big endorsement for me, because Alan Ritchie was like the savior of my Xamarin Forms early days. He was the guy with all the things Xamarin that everyone needed. So his endorsement, in my opinion, is a big win.
Agreed.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. And as such a important open source contributor to the community, that means a lot, man. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, then, since we're all in love with this library, Brandon, so can we take a look at some code and kind of just actually see what it looks like inside of an editor?
Yeah, I'll do a quick shameless plug. Git Trends. This is an app that I made. You can download it from the iOS and Android app stores. It's actually not in .NET MAUI yet, but it is a fully featured app. It's still written in Xamarin Forms. I'm slowly porting it over to MAUI. But it's all open source. So if you go to gittrends.com, that just forwards you to the GitHub repo. And you can see how I made this entire real App Store app using the C# markup extensions. So like I said, it's not in .NET MAUI yet, but someday soon, maybe if you're watching this a year from now, hopefully I've got it ported over. But I do want to highlight
the same though, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Nothing that you would have in there is really any different than you would have in the MAUI side.
Yep, except, new features like these typed bindings don't exist back for the Xamarin Forms C# markup extensions. But yeah, check out Git Trends, because I get people asking me all the time, like, yeah, but how would you do, like, this works fine for sample apps, and like it's like no, like, you can use it for real App Store apps. But so yeah, so I definitely want to jump into some code, but I've also got a couple things I want to highlight here. I think we've talked about most of them so far, but in terms of C# versus XAML, you're going to get better performance if you write your UI in C#, because, long story short, C# is ahead of time compiled, whereas XAML is interpreted. XAML does have this thing called the XAML compiler, also known as XAML C, but if you actually look into it, it only compiles some of the XAML. It doesn't know how to compile all the XAML, so your XAML UI will still, even using XAML C, loads slower. And now with these new bindings we've debuted in the C# markup extensions that don't require reflection, your bindings are going to execute faster. Got a slight asterisk here. If you're doing relative binding source, and we won't go into that, but if you know what that means and you're doing it, that still requires reflection, because it's got to go up and down hierarchical trees, yada, yada, yada. We touched on refactoring and maintenance. It becomes a lot easier to refactor and maintain your app if you're using C# instead of XAML, because all of the tools in Visual Studio are built for C#. So things like right-click and renaming a variable. If you do that and you've written your UI in XAML, well, let's say that XAML UI is bound to this variable. Well, the XAML code doesn't know that you just renamed it. And if you don't have XAML C turned on, like, you could probably compile your app, run it, and then all of a sudden your app's broken, and you have no idea why. Whereas if everything's in C#, you right-click and rename that variable, Visual Studio renames that everywhere. So eventually you're going to have to do that in your apps if you're pushing them to the App Store and you're maintaining them. Much, much easier with C#. And same thing with binding references. If you just right-click on a variable and say find all references in Visual Studio, it'll show you everywhere where your C# code is referencing that variable. But if you're referencing it from XAML, good luck. That's a big pain point for me when I'm rewriting logic or rewriting UI for an app that uses XAML, because I want to delete a property in my view model, but I don't know if it's being used elsewhere. And so you have to comb through line by line in the XAML code, be like, okay, I think I'm good, and I'm going to do a Control F and do a search on the whole project, but I've still, even as trying to be as careful as I can, I've broken code by deleting variables because I didn't think they were being used, because the Visual Studio tools just aren't built for XAML. And then one of the other nice things, Alan kind of touched on this, there's a lot of what I'll call unnecessary overhead in XAML. So like if you want to create a custom type, like I have a entry here that's called custom return entry. Well, in XAML, you first have to define that namespace just so you can reference it. And then if you want to use constants, like this automation ID constants, it's just a static class that has a bunch of public const strings in it. So just constants. Like in C#, we just pass in the string constant like we normally would. But for some reason in XAML, you have to say this x:static, and then you also have to define that namespace above in XAML. And you get this just crazy syntax here that is, it's something that I've never been able to memorize. I always have to go look back up. Whereas when you're doing it in C#, it's very intuitive because C# can handle constant strings. That's super easy.
The same thing we do
I don't like the
everywhere,
red.
every day. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
I didn't like the red either.
Yeah, the syntax highlighting.
Static is one thing, but then there's this static resource thing, right? So like if you aren't smart like me and you just are typing and not paying attention to what you're typing, you'll break that at least once or twice a day. I've done it. So.
Oh yeah. And speaking of static resources, we got one right down here because converters are a pain in XAML. So like in C#, we can just put in our converter here in line with an anonymous function or a lambda or a func or however you want to define it. But in XAML, because if I'm being honest, XAML wasn't designed for how we're using it today. It was created with a static UI in mind. And then somebody came along and were like, well, okay, but what if I need to change something on the page? And then like the idea of bindings came about. And then it's like, okay, well, what if I want to reference a class? And the idea of static resources came about. So like all these bolt-ons came to XAML. And so, this idea of converters where your view model provides a certain property and you want to convert it from, in this case, from an int to a bool or a bool back to an int. You have to leave your XAML, go back into C#, create a class that inherits from iValue converter, and implement all these things and these aren't type safe. Like everything you see is like object and you have to cast it. This is nasty. If you ever had to create a converter, you've probably hated the experience. I know I have. And then, just to even add it into your XAML code, you have to define it, like Rodney was saying, as a static resource, which, what does that even mean? But in our C# UI, I can just bind directly to an entry. I can pass that in as the source here. So I've defined an entry above up here. I've created a new entry. I pass it in as my source. I bind to its entry text. And I just say, hey, if that text length doesn't equal 0, then it is enabled, and we can just do it all in line. We don't have to create extra classes, extra code, or any extra overhead, which is really, really nice. But ultimately, I think this is what we're talking about is we need to flatten the learning curve because learning mobile is really, really hard. Like if you want to become a .NET MAUI developer, you have to know C#. You have to learn, I think there are over 200,000 iOS and Android APIs now, because they add more APIs every time they come out with a new software update, and we just have to know about that as mobile developers. And then, you have to learn .NET MAUI and how that framework works. You have to learn MVVM. You got to know dependency injection, asynchronous programming, like async await. Like this is high-level stuff that we shouldn't expect junior engineers to know. But just like this is to become a mobile developer, this is what you have to learn. And if you have to then learn XAML on top of all of this, you're just making it harder for your developers. Yeah. So this is one of the big things for me with XAML. Like when I joined Xamarin, when I worked with them or worked there back in the day, I heard about this funny sounding company, Xamarin. I was like, what do they do? And it's like, oh, I can make iOS and Android apps in C#. And it's like, that's great because I've always wanted to make a mobile app. I already know C#. And so ever since then, the whole value proposition of using C# was great. And I was always wondering, like, okay, but then why do we then slide in this XAML? Like, hey, you can use C#, but just kidding. Here's some XAML you gotta learn too. So
never mind, don't look at that.
Right. Like, with a little bait and switch. So we can also flatten the learning curve for our junior devs. So, but enough about that. Let's actually show off an app that I have here. I've got it running side by side. Let's see if I can make this a little bigger. So this app is called MAUI Converter. there's some really cool libraries that this is highlighting inside of .NET MAUI that they contain all these conversions for you. So if you ever wanted to convert something from like, let's say like what's 100 kilometers in miles, I'm not actually doing these calculations. I'm just using the built-in .NET MAUI libraries that convert kilometers to miles for me. So I thought this would be a fun app. I made it because I travel a lot. So when somebody tells me that, you know, it's 100 kilometers away or like the temperature's 13 Celsius, like, what does that mean? And so I'll just pull up my handy little app here. But what I wanted to show off, and we saw like a snippet of this in Fahrenheit to Fahrenheit. How about Kelvin? So we saw a snippet of this in the slides, but yeah, just how readable this becomes. And if you're already familiar with creating .NET MAUI apps in XAML, this should look and feel really, really familiar, but with some of these bonuses we've talked about. So we talked about how, I'll keep this up so we can look at them side by side, but you know, we can name our rows. And the way we do this, I just create an enum down here called row. I create an enum called column. And when I've designed my UI, I know I'm going to have a row called unit type. So I made an enum row unit type and number to convert row and original units row. And then here you can see there's 2 columns. And sometimes like this button spans across both columns, or this conversion result expands across both columns. But in general, we've got a grid here with 2 columns and I don't know how many rows, I didn't count them. But when we come back up here, it becomes super easy to start defining our rows, like how big is each row? And we can use this star value. You've probably seen this in XAML as an asterisk. Star just means it's going to be proportional to anything else that is using a star. So what we're saying here is this row, this row, this row, this row, this row are all going to be the same height. And then this row down here, I want it to be 2 stars. So the button's going to have a little bit of a bigger row. And then likewise in my columns, star, star. So they're going to be proportional. They're just going to split the screen down the middle. And then as we start adding our children, what's really cool, and one of the things I really love about C#, you know, we're talking about dark purple label when we were looking at the slides earlier. This is just a class I created, because what we can do now that everything's in C# is if we have, in this case, we have this label that we're using multiple times. So I could redefine it every time. Like I could say this is a new label and its background color is going to be, you know, and we could redefine it every time. Or like the good C# developers we are, we can just define it once, or lazy is probably a better word. And then we can reuse that code. And this is something that always bugs me about XAML is you can't create, say, a label in XAML and then go to a different XAML file and reuse that. And again, that's where, like, that's one of the downsides. That's why like styles exist. Like styles exist because XAML can't reuse code. And so that's just another bolt-on that we had to do for XAML, just to like do something kind of simple, like reusing code. So yeah, we've got our dark purple label in the row unit type column label right here. You know, we've got our picker, which I've also created a custom picker for this. And so we can easily add in our code. We've got our bindings here. So we can have either one-time bindings, or like this is a 2-way binding where this is us retrieving the value from our view model. And then if anything changes, we can tell it how to update the value in the view model from the user in the UI. So highly recommend everybody playing around with this. I would love feedback. I mean, don't get me wrong, I appreciate all the great praise we've gotten on the library today, but yeah, there's definitely things missing. You know, I'm essentially the only developer working on it. If you go look at the commit history, there's me, and then the next highest contributor is Dependabot. So me and Dependabot taking on the world. But yeah, what you get this really fluid, nice UI where, you know, if there's something wrong, like I want to update this original units row, like we can quickly kind of scroll down to see like, okay, well, where is that down here? Okay, row original units, column input. Okay, so this is it. And we can really quickly get to where we need to be. And likewise with having these bindings here that they're all typed bindings. There's no reflection going on. So we get almost instantaneous updates between our view and our view model because we don't have to go through any reflection anymore, which is always really, really good. So whew, we're almost out of time. So I'll go ahead and pause and throw it back to you guys.
Yeah, I think, so there's a lot of code on the screen. But I'm saying that because even though there's a lot of code on the screen, for someone that is not a MAUI mobile Xamarin developer, like it looks very readable. Because for me, like you're just instantiating classes, right? From my perspective, and you're like sticking them in the properties that they're supposed to go in. Versus if I was supposed to read probably like the equivalents in XAML, I probably have to stare at it a little bit longer to probably understand like what exactly is happening, right? So for me, like this is still a readable thing for me to look at. And I also liked how you showed how you created that custom label, because now showing like the composability of it, right? Like now I am like supercharging my controls, but I'm still just using C#, right? Like I'm not doing anything different. Anything different that we would have written in any other .NET based application.
Right.
I think the one question I have with this now is that, because I'm guessing like your Fluent syntax is based on what's in the core library, right? So like what happens if I'm using like custom controls? If I'm using something from, I don't know, Syncfusion, whatever it is, like do they plug in the same way? Does that change anything?
I'm glad you asked. So I'll pull up the code while I'm talking about it, but one of the cool things when MAUI was created versus Xamarin Forms is everything was created using interfaces. So if we jump into something like label extensions, what I'm doing is, this is probably the worst example. Dang, let me jump into image extensions.
Yeah, and then could you control plus that just a little bit, or maybe close like the symbols thing at the right side if you could?
Yep, good call. So these are just extension methods, so they return the same type that you pass into it. And what we use is the interfaces. So yeah, you could actually create your own brand new .NET MAUI control. And if you use the .NET MAUI interfaces, it'll work. If you just want to extend a button, like I created dark purple label, I just inherited from label, it'll work because everything's based off of these interfaces. And what's really cool is these interfaces are actually in the core library of MAUI. And so there's other UIs built on top of those. So like we've been talking about .NET MAUI controls, which is like the MVVM and the XAML, or in our case, C#. But there's also libraries like Comet that uses MVU for its architecture, and it's built on top of the MAUI core library. So in theory, like this will still work even with that. So yeah, everything's based off of interfaces. So if you create your own custom thing, it'll still work totally fine. So like as long as this is an I image, then we can change its aspect ratio.
The only other thing I'd throw out, I don't know if you could go back to your code sample really quick. On line 50, where was it? 2. So on the entry, even if you had like a custom control that didn't work with the Fluent extensions, you could still go in and just use the property constructor like you would in any case. So like on line 52 with assigning the keyboard, it's just a regular property assignment like you would do anywhere. So even if we couldn't use the Fluent extensions, you could still build your object in line, set all the properties that you need to, and do everything like that. Maybe not in as nice of a fashion, but still pretty close, I would say.
Okay.
I think the draw here, Cecil, is that this is declarative, right? So it's you are declaring the row and the column and the placeholder and the text, versus if you were to do all of this in property assignments, it immediately becomes less readable because now you have to find the property and the assignment versus it's just set to this thing.
Like it would end up looking something like this down here where you could set the placeholder to be enter number and you could do it all like this, but
it's not as readable in my opinion. So,
it loses that. Exactly.
So it gives you flexibility where you need it, but it gives you in my opinion.
Okay. Yeah. So another question I have about it because so Brandon, in the beginning, you mentioned so you're the primary only person that's working on the library right now, and there's some things you said that are missing. And so when you said that, a question pops into my head was, is there a world where you mix XAML and this markup together, or is it like one or the other? I'm either going like all in on code, or I'm going all in on XAML, or is there like
yeah.
a hodgepodge thing where
So
you pick and choose one for one purpose and one for another purpose?
totally. Like, for example, even in our community toolkit, so we've been talking about this is the MAUI markup community toolkit, but we also have just a MAUI community toolkit as well. But yeah, in the sample app for this, we create some of our pages using C# markup, and we create some of them using XAML. And the reason I did that, I was the one that kind of forced it in there, but was because you can't reuse that XAML code. So there was a lot of pages that they're going to be exactly the same, just the title's different. And do we really want to force our community contributors to have to create a whole new XAML class every time? Or they could just inherit from our C# class and then they're good to go. So yeah, if you have a app where there's already some XAML in it, you can create your new stuff in C# using Community Toolkit. But yeah, as far as the MAUI markup project ever doing anything in XAML, probably not. It's, at least today, it's pretty much exclusively just, I say just, but extension methods. It just makes it easier to write your C# code. But I'm not against it. But yeah, I don't see a way, at least today, where we could improve XAML other than just leaving it for C#.
I wasn't asking from the perspective of you doing it, but more so, I'm using your library. I'm building an app. I'm using your library, and I'm having like this C# based declaration, and maybe a page or two that has like XAML on it, right?
Yep.
So not from your library perspective, but just from me as an app developer, that's like the consumer, right? Like is there like a pattern or a reason why or why not I should do that?
If there's a ton of crazy reasons. Like you might have somebody on your team that is super fluent in XAML, but doesn't know, or maybe not so much in C#, so they can knock out 2 pages in a day if they can write it in XAML, and you need to ship it on Friday. So you just say, okay, yeah, like go ahead, and maybe we'll convert it later. Or vice versa, you inherit an older app. Like I've had this happen to me where I inherit these apps, and 9 times out of 10 they're using XAML, but I'm more fluent in C#. So for me to use XAML is the opposite. It has that overhead where I'm gonna have to look up, okay, what is X static, and how do I make a static resource, and how do I make a converter? Whereas I could knock it out in C# by the end of the day. So yeah, you can mix and match it. Totally, depends on the team, depends on everybody's skill sets, or maybe you're just looking to update or modernize, and you want to do it one page at a time. So maybe you want to convert that XAML page to C# for the next release, and then the next release after that, you'll convert another page. And so, yeah, you can mix and match them. Reason's probably going to be unique to every team, though.
Okay. So, and like you said, like we are running low on time, but there's one more question I personally love to ask, and if anyone else wants to ask some more questions too. So you're using Xamarin, Visual Studio for Mac, and the reason why I want to call this, I'm not going to say anything controversial, I promise. The reason why I want to call this out is because, for me, I've always found that like VS for Mac doesn't necessarily get the same amount of tooling that we do on the Windows side.
Thank you for asking this. Yeah.
I'm
a Mac user.
This
is not going to be a controversial question. I'm just saying I appreciate it, because one of the reasons why I think I am leaning towards, and again, I'm not a mobile developer, but one of the reasons why I'm leaning towards just going all in on C# for building these UIs is because a lot of the things like the hot reloads and all of the other fancy tooling that exists on Windows machines in Visual Studio, what is it, 2022 or whatever the current version is, doesn't exist on our side of the world, right? And so for me, like this kind of just makes sense because, like you said, like refactoring works, which works in any C# thing. Refactoring, debugging, like everything works the same because it's just C#. So for me, I don't need any extra magic, right, to make that
Totally.
a good experience for me.
Yeah,
Totally.
and I'll give a quick shout out. There is an awesome library. If you're using XAML, there's a library called mfractor that I would say I wouldn't write XAML without it because a lot of the tooling that Cecil's mentioning that's missing is provided in mfractor and then some. You'll even get, I forget all the features, but yeah, it just came out with support for Visual Studio for Mac, like a week or so ago. So hot off the presses, mfractor. Highly, highly recommend that. But yeah, man, I'm old habits die hard. Visual Studio for Mac, and kind of one of the reasons it's still not up to par with Visual Studio is when Microsoft bought Xamarin back in the day, we had this IDE called Xamarin Studio that let you create apps in C# on your Mac. And then when the acquisition happened, somebody who's obviously not a developer caught wind of this and was like, oh, there's an IDE for Mac that we own now. We should just rename it to Visual Studio for Mac. And like, I'm internally just screaming it, like, no, like shouting, like, don't do that because it's made for Xamarin developers. As soon as you call it Visual Studio, everybody, and rightfully so, is going to think like, oh, shoot, Microsoft now created Visual Studio for the Mac. So I can do my ASP.NET Core stuff. I can do my Docker stuff. I can like anything I can do in Visual Studio, I can do on a Mac now. And it was literally they just changed the name and the icon. And so you got left with a lot of angry, confused developers. And again, rightfully so, they shouldn't have done that. And the Visual Studio team has just continued chugging along and improving it. And I think Visual Studio on the PC is the best IDE, period. And so they keep adding new features to it, and it's great. But like, the Visual Studio for Mac developers have always just been like trying to play catch up. They're like, the train's left the station, and they're trying to chase it down. Like, hey, wait for us. We want these features too. And really, like, it just sucks for us. It sucks for the developer that you see this shiny new toy. Like Visual Studio on PC has like spell check now, which is really, really good. And really, really embarrassing for anytime I open my code in it now, because it's like all these words are spelled wrong. I'm like, oh wow, like yeah, it's been open sourced for a long time. Whoops. When's that coming to Visual Studio for Mac? I don't know. I'm not holding my breath. But a lot of developers use JetBrains Rider on the Mac. So if you try out Visual Studio for Mac and it doesn't suit your needs or you find it frustrating for whatever reason, also check out JetBrains Rider, because a lot of people nowadays are like, oh, you're still using Visual Studio for Mac? I'm like, yeah, but like I used to work at Xamarin. Like I know all the key bindings and like it's just still very intuitive for me. And I know all the bugs and I can work around them.
The same Stockholm syndrome that I have.
Yeah.
It might not be great, but it's great for me.
I'll go ahead and do the controversial bit that Cecil wouldn't do. I have not used Visual Studio for Mac since 2017. I have been using JetBrains Rider that entire time. I have had type checking and all of these typo fixes. I've had those for years, so I don't have to worry about it, right? Like my open source stuff is pristine, right? I ain't worried about that stuff. I have JetBrains Rider behind me, and they care about C# developers on Mac. I said it.
I think the
I
thing
want to
is,
say
though,
something.
He's not lying.
Can I say something?
That's good. That's good.
I will say that like when I first started learning how to code in C#, like it took me like several months before I figured out like, oh, there is a difference between Visual Studio and Visual Studio for Mac.
And you shouldn't have to. Like that's always been my complaint is like, you guys, like you can change the name once it's got feature parity, but you're just going to confuse developers until the end of time because it still hasn't caught up. Like it's been Visual Studio rebranded as Visual Studio for Mac for what, 5 years now?
There will be no parity.
It's still behind. Yeah.
Like,
I think the thing though is like whether you're on Visual Studio for Windows or Rider or Mac or whatever IDE you go to in the future, if it's for .NET in C#, the thing it's going to do the best is .NET in C#. right? So like, even if it's not the best actual IDE, it's the one, again, Visual Studio for Mac. I love it to the end of time.
Yeah.
It might not be the best, but I still do love it. But it does, C# is the thing though, right? So regardless of where you go, even if the XAML tooling is lagging or whatever it is isn't as good, its focus is all the focus for all these IDEs is going to be C#. So working that, it's going to be the best thing. It's going to have the best tooling. So yeah, working the thing that it does best, right? Don't dance around it.
Right. Well, I mean, which is why I wanted to bring it up in the first place, because again, if the XAML tooling is not on parity, then us writing like these apps using Brandon's toolkit and using raw C#, it makes complete and total sense.
Yeah.
So,
I agree.
For sure.
that makes sense.
I agree.
But that being said, I feel like there's so much more that we could talk about. We're actually going to talk some more next week. Michael's actually going to come back, and he's going to be talking to us about how we could build MAUI applications using reactive extensions. I'm trying to bring the thing up.
I knew it was going to be reactive extensions.
You knew it.
I was like, it seems like Cecil's looking for the page to remember what it was. Like, it's got to be reactive.
Forward, of course.
So for folks that are watching, thank you all for being here. This is going to be next week, Wednesday, same time, same channel. So make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, give us comments and all that fun YouTube stuff that we're supposed to do. And hopefully we'll see you next week. We can talk more about building MAUI apps with reactive extensions. So that being the case, thank you all so much, and we'll see you all next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye.